Today, we're going to compare Ubuntu 24.04 and Fedora 40, the two largest and most influential distros in the Linux scene, in multiple different categories to see which is the overall winner.
Also, join the PenguinByte Discord community to be notified of announcements and uploads, ask questions, participate in polls and decisions, and chat with me and the community about Linux, tech, and other topics. Link in the description below. The two distros will be ranked in 7 categories: base system, user experience, efficiency, performance, stability, compatibility, and security.
Before we get into anything, I will be testing both distros in virtual machines, so they may have some lags, screen tearing, and not yield the best performance and efficiency results. Results are better on real hardware.
Firstly, what are the two distros based on? Ubuntu is in the Debian family of distros, based directly off of Debian, while Fedora is independent, not based on any other distro. Next, what packaging format do they use? Since Ubuntu comes from the Debian family, it uses deb packages, while Fedora uses RPM packages. Those are both the traditional packaging formats, and debs can't run on Fedora, nor can RPMs run on Ubuntu, because Ubuntu and Fedora are built differently under the hood, but both distros also ship containerized packaging formats. A containerized package contains all of the libraries and dependencies it needs to run in one portable container that can run on all distros and multiple different architectures. Libraries and dependencies commonly used by many apps are shipped separately as runtimes, and an older version of a runtime with older versions of the same libraries and dependencies can coexist with a newer version of the runtime, preventing conflicts and dependency hell. Ubuntu ships Snap and Fedora ships Flatpak. Both are containerized, universal packaging formats that work on all Linux distros, and provide additional security and stability, as well as other benefits, but of course, they also have their drawbacks, like being less integrated into the system. They are very similar in many ways, but also have multiple differences, which I actually covered recently in a separate video that you can check out, link in the description and top right corner. But to list a few, Flatpak allows you to make your own repo, and there are multiple Flatpak repos like FlatHub, Fedora Flatpaks, and more, while Snap only has one repo, the Snap Store. Also, Snap supports graphical and text-based apps, and potentially even things like desktop environments and kernels in the future, while Flatpak only supports graphical apps officially. Also, Snap is made by corporate Canonical, while Flatpaks are made by the community, but backed by Red Hat. There are of course tons of other differences, but those are a few of the big ones. Also, since Snap and Flatpak are universal packaging formats, you can run Snaps on Fedora and Flatpaks on Ubuntu, although you'll first need to do some setup to get them working on distros they aren't pre-installed on. And which package managers do these distros use? Since Ubuntu comes from the Debian family, it uses the apt package manager, while Fedora uses the DNF package manager. They have a few differences in their syntax and the way they work, but the syntax is overall pretty similar. Sudo apt install package name to install an app with apt, for example, and sudo dnf install package name to do so with dnf. Same with removing an app. Sudo apt remove package name for apt, and sudo dnf remove package name for dnf. This is the case with most of the more common commands. Apt and DNF also have graphical frontends. For example, Synaptic Package Manager for apt and DNF Dragora for DNF, but most people just use the terminal or the simpler graphical software center. There are some other differences. For example, DNF has a different UI in the terminal that in my opinion looks nicer and more organized, but both get the job done. Moving on to the release cycle, Ubuntu gets updates every 6 months or every 2 years if you only count LTS releases. Regarding packages in the repos, Ubuntu follows a semi-rolling release cycle for the 6-month releases, which means packages in the repos will get updates when they come out, except for the base system packages, and a fixed cycle for the LTS releases, meaning packages in the LTS repos won't get updates until the next LTS release, aside from a few exceptions, and of course, security updates. Fedora, on the other hand, follows a 6-month semi-rolling release cycle and gets the latest software when it's ready, usually sooner than Ubuntu. Fedora also innovates a lot more, usually being the first distro to include new technologies and software. For example, Fedora was the first distro to have Pulse Audio, Pipewire, Wayland, Systemd, Flatpaks, portals, the concept of immutable distros with Fedora Atomic desktops, and a lot more. Then the rest of the Linux distros follow. Ubuntu usually sticks with the stable, proven technologies, and like other distros, often waits a while, and then follows in adopting new technologies after Fedora implements them. Overall, the winner of this category mostly comes down to personal preference, but DNF is much better in many ways, like having a better interface, better syntax, from my experience, usually faster speeds, although we'll test that later, and more. I also prefer that Fedora remains more innovative and gets packages sooner, so Fedora wins the base system category. Firstly, let's start with the live environment and installer. Before the installer loads, both distros give you the option to try the distro or install it right away. Clicking the try option boots you into a live environment running off the USB stick that doesn't affect your current system and lets you play around with the distro before installing it. Then you can launch the installer when you're ready, or if you change your mind, exit the live environment. Onto the installation process, Ubuntu recently switched to their new Ubiquity installer, which is written in Flutter, and the new installer got a slight redesign in the latest Ubuntu release, which improved the layout, graphics, and options. It looks really beautiful and modern, there's no doubting that, and it's overall one of my favorite installers in Linux, but it's also fairly slow, especially compared to Fedora's Anaconda. While Ubiquity follows a more traditional installer UI that goes step by step, Anaconda does it a bit unconventionally by showing you every option on the screen and letting you pick the options you want to configure. Many find this to be weird, but I personally don't see any issue with it. Also, Ubiquity has slides talking about Ubuntu's features, and it has a feature that lets you view the terminal output if you want to see that. Anaconda is simpler and does not have any slides showcasing Fedora's features or any cool graphics. It actually doesn't even include any account creation or system customization steps. Anaconda only installs the system and uses GNOME's first setup wizard to do everything else, which I actually really like. Also, Ubiquity gives you choice between a more minimal installation with only a web browser and basic system utilities, which is the default, and a more complete installation with office suites, multimedia programs, and a lot more pre-installed. Next, let's talk about the out-of-the-box experience. Both Ubuntu and Fedora provide a really good out-of-the-box experience. They both usually just work, and of course, like most Linux distros, they don't require the terminal in most use cases. Basically, anything you can do graphically on Windows and macOS can be done graphically on Ubuntu and Fedora.
One advantage Ubuntu has over Fedora is it has a lot of codecs pre-installed, while with Fedora, you need to install a lot of the codecs yourself. And it takes a good amount of effort. Let's do it right now, actually.
Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to do is open the Software Center and search for DNF Dragora. If you haven't already, you need to install it. I already have installed it, so I'm going to open it, and we're just going to leave this here. Now we're going to open Firefox, and go to these two websites, rpmfusion.org/rpmfusion, and rpmfusion.org/how-to/multimedia. Okay, so on rpmfusion.org here, we're going to want to enable RPM Fusion on your system. Grab for Fedora 40 RPM Fusion free right over here. We can now double click this and just install. Once that's finished, you can close the window and now grab the non-free package down here. Again, double click and install. Once you've finished that, again, close the window. And now we've finished setting up RPM Fusion. Now what we're going to want to do is we want to enable the codecs. So go to rpmfusion.org/how-to/multimedia. And we want to start at the very top over here by switching to full FFmpeg. So I believe you could do this in the graphical package manager. If we search for FFmpeg in DNF Dragora, you have multiple versions here. So yes, we can actually replace FFmpeg free with FFmpeg over here, the full version. Since I've already pasted this command in the terminal, I'll just hit Y. We'll get into how to manage packages here in DNF Dragora in a second. Okay, now that we've completed that, this command right here will need the terminal. Just copy and paste. Same with this one. Now, sudo dnf update sound and video may cause some problems initially. If we just paste this command in the terminal and hit enter, we will probably get an error, yes. So it says no group marked for upgrade. So what we first need to do is sudo dnf-v group install sound and video, hit Y, and there we go. Next, what we want to do is we're going to want to install the Intel Media Driver. You can do this in RPM Fusion if you just search Intel-Media-Driver if you don't already have it. Okay, here we go. So, the one you're going to want is x86-64, the latest version to 24.2.5 for me over here. You'll want to hit the check mark over here and hit apply. Okay. Enter your password. Hit yes. Okay. And done. It is now installed. Also, you'll want to search libva-intel-driver for older Intel codecs over here. So x86-64. Apply. Now that that's finished, if you have AMD, you'll want to copy and paste these commands into your terminal, or with NVIDIA, you'll want to copy and paste these. I don't have either of those, so I'm not going to worry about these two sections. If you do want to play DVD though, you'll want to paste the following commands. I'm not sure if you can install repos through DNF Dragora. Let's test that, I guess. You actually can, which is surprising, so again, install that. Apply. And once that's finished, what you'll want to do is you'll want to install libdvdcss. To do so, we're going to just, again, search for it and install. Okay, now that we've finished that, we want to install RPM Fusion non-free release tainted. And once that's finished, you'll want to copy and paste this command into your terminal. Now we have installed all of the codecs from the RPM Fusion website.
As you can see, that took a little while and is one of the rare cases where you need a little bit of terminal use in Linux. I would normally do this whole process through the terminal because I love using the terminal, but I wanted to show you how to do it graphically as much as possible. So Ubuntu is clearly a lot better with regards to pre-including multimedia codecs and drivers, but Fedora ties in heavily with the GNOME desktop environment, creating a much more seamless and consistent experience.
For example, updates are tied in perfectly with the GNOME Software Center. GNOME's first setup utility is used when setting up the computer. Flatpaks tie in heavily with GNOME and GNOME software, and in general, a lot of GNOME's functions are integrated very well like that throughout Fedora. Ubuntu heavily customizes its version of GNOME and doesn't tie in as well with the desktop environment like Fedora does. For example, Ubuntu uses its own Ubuntu App Center instead of GNOME software, and has its own update tool, but it does still provide a good GNOME experience. And those tweaks that Ubuntu makes implement a lot of traditional features that GNOME doesn't have, and don't make much sense to people like me, who have gotten used to GNOME's unique workflow, but make the switch from other operating systems like macOS and Windows significantly easier. For example, GNOME only includes a close button by default, but Ubuntu adds maximize and minimize buttons. GNOME also hides the dock in the overview by default, but Ubuntu makes it visible on the desktop. Ubuntu also includes desktop icons and tray icons by default, and notification badges on apps in the dock and app grid, a more consistent light mode, and much more. Those last two would definitely be nice to see by default in GNOME. GNOME overall is extremely simple and easy to use, and its design is very beautiful and modern, but it is a less traditional desktop environment, and Fedora implements GNOME how it's meant to be used, but Ubuntu makes it a lot more user-friendly for beginners who are used to more traditional desktops and workflows. GNOME is also less customizable than some other desktop environments, and if for whatever reason you don't like it, Ubuntu offers different flavors of Ubuntu with different desktop environments, like Kubuntu, which uses KDE for people who want a more traditional, customizable, and powerful desktop, Xubuntu, which uses XFCE if you want a more lightweight option, Lubuntu, which uses LXQT if your computer is a prehistoric potato, Ubuntu Cinnamon if you want a more Windows-like experience, Ubuntu Budgie, I don't really see any reason to use Budgie, but it does sort of resemble macOS, so it could be a good option for Mac users. Ubuntu Mate if you want a lightweight and traditional but unique desktop, or if you loved GNOME 2. Ubuntu Studio if you do creative work like music creation, photo and video editing, etc. Ubuntu Unity if you want a simple, modern desktop or you're nostalgic for older Ubuntu versions, Ubuntu if you're a student, and tons more. Fedora is similar. It offers spins, which are basically Fedora with a different desktop environment or window manager, and include KDE, XFCE, Cinnamon, Mate, LXQT, LXDE, and Budgie, SOAS for kids, and i3 and Sway tiling window managers. There are also Fedora Labs, which are made for special use cases, like astronomy, which is self-explanatory, Comp Neuro for neuroscience, Design Suite for creative work, Games for gaming, Jam for audio work, Python Classroom for Python development, Scientific for science, and finally, Security Lab for penetration testing. Fedora also has Atomic desktops, which are immutable versions of Fedora Workstation and the KDE, Budgie, and Sway spins. Moving on to general ease of use, once you get used to the different workflow and how to do things, for example installing apps from the App Store instead of hunting for installers online, you can usually just jump right in and start using your system right away with both Ubuntu and Fedora, except for Codex and Fedora. That's an exception. Both distros have nice features like your printers and other devices working usually out of the box due to drivers being pre-included in the kernel. Overall, both distros make it easy to navigate your system and get work done, but Ubuntu has more codecs and system software out of the box, and it's a more traditional desktop, which is more appealing to newer users, so Ubuntu wins the user experience category.
Firstly, let's test RAM and CPU usage on idle.
Ubuntu uses 1.26 gigabytes of RAM and 7% CPU, while Fedora uses 1.72 gigabytes of RAM and 9% CPU.
Now let's test RAM and CPU usage with 3 Firefox tabs open.
Ubuntu uses 2.15 gigabytes of RAM and 54% CPU, while Fedora uses 2.48 gigabytes of RAM and 53% CPU. Ubuntu wins the RAM and CPU tests, but things change completely when we look at storage use. Ubuntu in its stock state took 11.8 gigabytes of disk space, while Fedora in its stock state used 4.9 gigabytes of disk space, making Fedora drastically lighter.
The funny thing is, this is the minimal install of Ubuntu, which has less graphical software pre-installed than Fedora, yet Fedora takes 2 to 3 times less disk space.
While Fedora uses a lot less storage, Ubuntu won the resource tests, so Ubuntu wins the efficiency category. Firstly, let's take a look at the installation speed for both distros. Fedora finishes first at 7 minutes and 24 seconds. And Ubuntu finishes last at 18 minutes and 10 seconds. Next, let's see how long both distros take to boot. Ubuntu boots first at 20 seconds. And Fedora boots last at 25 seconds. Now let's compare apt and DNF to see which one is faster at installing and removing packages. First, GIMP. Apt took 7 seconds to install it and 4 seconds to remove it. DNF took 40 seconds to install it and 6 seconds to remove it. Second, NeoFetch. Apt took 14 seconds to install it and 5 seconds to remove it. DNF took 9 seconds to install it and 4 seconds to remove it. Finally, Inkscape. Apt took 23 seconds to install it and 5 seconds to remove it. DNF took 33 seconds to install it and also 5 seconds to remove it. Surprisingly, Apt is actually faster. The next release of Fedora is getting DNF 5, which is a complete rewrite of DNF and is supposed to be much faster, so I may need to redo this comparison when that comes out, but for now, let's move on to app launch times. First, let's launch GIMP twice. On Ubuntu, GIMP took 8 seconds on first launch and 4 seconds on second launch. On Fedora, GIMP took 20 seconds on first launch and 5 seconds on second launch. GIMP was faster on Ubuntu. Next, let's launch Inkscape twice. On Ubuntu, Inkscape took 7 seconds on first launch and 19 seconds on second launch. On Fedora, Inkscape took 11 seconds on first launch and 9 seconds on second launch. Inkscape was faster on Fedora. Lastly, let's test file transfer speeds. I will copy a 2.3 GB file to a different folder and see which distro does it the fastest. Fedora does it instantaneously, while Ubuntu takes 15 seconds to complete the transfer, so Fedora was faster. Fedora and Ubuntu trade blows, but Ubuntu won more of the tests, so Ubuntu wins the performance category. Starting with Ubuntu, it is generally quite stable, but it has had many issues from my experience. I made a dedicated video covering my experience using Ubuntu for a month, if you want to check that out, but I ran into several errors just trying to test Ubuntu against Fedora and the virtual machine. I barely even did anything, like the desktop icons extension acting weirdly, only letting me select like half of the screen, and the home folder cutting off sometimes, and getting a random error report when I didn't even do anything.
And again, that was just when testing Ubuntu in the VM. When I used it for 30 days, it didn't really have too many issues, but it did regularly give me error reports, although they didn't affect my experience much, and various other issues.
Moving on to Fedora, it is probably not only the most stable Linux distro, but the most stable operating system in general that I've ever used. I used Fedora for a whole year a while back, and recently I used it for about a month, maybe less, and Fedora always just works.
I've never had any issues with it that I can recall, except for two. The first one, Fedora completely crashed, but I believe that was because I overloaded my computer, and the second time, I tried to switch from my integrated graphics to my dedicated NVIDIA GPU, and that threw my system into a boot loop when I installed the proprietary NVIDIA drivers. But I was able to fix that by somehow messing around in systemd and the boot process, and when I removed the NVIDIA drivers, everything worked fine again.
Fedora in general manages to remain extremely stable even when I try messing with the system, and also considering the fact that Fedora is an innovative and cutting-edge distro, it's pretty impressive. So overall, Fedora easily wins the stability category. When it comes to compatibility, Ubuntu's repositories are significantly larger than Fedora's and contain thousands more apps, although both have tons of apps. Also, since Ubuntu is much more widely used, many software is developed only for Ubuntu, although most, especially the more popular apps, usually offer a Fedora version as well. Ubuntu also has much better hardware and driver support. In fact, it was the last distro to support my old 12-inch MacBook, while Fedora wouldn't work on it at all. Interestingly enough, I wasn't easily able to find any builds of Ubuntu Desktop for architectures other than x64, while Fedora Workstation easily lets you download builds for x64, ARM, and even PowerPC. Overall, Ubuntu has a lot more general software and hardware compatibility, so Ubuntu wins the compatibility category. Regarding security, both Ubuntu and Fedora are extremely secure, but Fedora is more secure. Ubuntu uses the AppArmor security system, which is strong, but Fedora uses SE Linux and other security technologies, and Fedora is also backed by Red Hat's security team.
Fedora enjoys robust, military-grade security, which is stronger than most other operating systems out there, including Ubuntu. Moving on to privacy, Ubuntu has opt-in data collection, some of which is a bit difficult to disable, while Fedora has none, except in problem reports, which you have to opt into.
Overall, Fedora is much more secure and private, so it wins the security and privacy category. So, Ubuntu won more categories and is the winner of this video.
But this doesn't mean it's better than Fedora. Both distros are great in their own ways, and I actually prefer Fedora personally.
But for the purposes of this video, Ubuntu won.
Subscribe if you like my content, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
If you really like my work and want to support me, I've just released a PenguinByte channel membership with 2 tiers. A King Penguin tier, which gives you a PenguinByte badge next to your username, access to exclusive emojis, and priority reply to comments, and an Emperor Penguin tier, which gives you everything in the King Penguin tier, plus shoutouts, members-only content, VIP Discord access, and more. Check them out by clicking the join button below. Also, shout out to the ELMVD crew for being my first member.
Thank you to my YouTube members for supporting my work, and all of you guys for being part of the community. And thanks for watching. See you next time.